Welcome back. Catherine opens chapter 6 entitled The Not-So-American Corporations with a cartoon. It isn't very funny because it has a bunch of old men looking like founding fathers with a document. Instead of that document saying "we the people," it says "we the corporations." You can take a look at that. I don't know if you'll be able to see it or not. Anyway, Catherine begins by saying that Americans have accepted corporate power and influence for decades as simply part of our economic system. I would argue that those of us who know what's going on do not accept it. But as a former prosecuting attorney and judge, Catherine would object and point out that she was clearly referring to Americans overall, and I'm just being argumentative. The point that she's making here is that unlike most companies that you're used to dealing with that are owned by individuals accountable for their actions, big corporations, especially global corporations, are shielded by laws and contracts. Remember in vid 11 when I did my redneck impression of Delphin Delmas arguing to the Supreme Court that the 14th Amendment was to serve as a shield against injustice? Well, thanks to their happy to oblige friends in Congress, big corporations have laws that literally shield them from not injustice, but shield them from justice. I'll give you some mind-blowing examples of that whenever I nerd whisper some other books, especially by David K. Johnston. But the point that Catherine makes is that giant corporations are not a part of any community, despite the impression that their marketing people might try to give you. Like the sociopaths they are, by their very nature, they have no shame whenever they're caught committing a crime. They feel no remorse whenever their actions harm people. The fines that they have to pay whenever they break the law, or when after years in court it's found that they've harmed people by their actions, those fines are just a cost of doing business to them. Getting back to the fact that most Americans have simply accepted corporate power and influence for decades, Catherine explains that it's much easier to ignore reality and just go on with life rather than question a situation we've accepted for so long, no matter how messed up it's become. Well, Catherine wrote this book 10 years ago, and I think most people would agree that the political and economic situation in America has become a lot more messed up in that time, which is why I'm doing this video series. I would think by now, would hope by now, most Americans would be willing to take Catherine's advice and take an honest look at what Adam Smith actually said. And what he said was that there is a huge, clear-cut distinction between real capitalism and corporatism, which, as I've said before, only just uses Adam Smith's principles like free market and capitalism as sick joke catchphrases and slogans. Most people don't even know that Adam Smith developed the idea of capitalism and then wrote Wealth of Nations to liberate people from the abomination of British mercantilism, which was the first kind of corporatism. Catherine devotes pretty much this entire chapter to explaining why what is called capitalism, especially when it comes to giant corporations, actually is not capitalism at all. In a nutshell, corporations care about profit, nothing else. Profit is income minus expenses. And the more that corporations, especially giant corporations, can do to shift expenses to somebody else, especially the taxpayers, the greater their profits. Like I've said before, literally trillions of dollars of government spending, most of it for defense, basic science, research and development, engineering. Trillions of dollars of government spending laid the foundation for what became the high-tech telecom and computer revolutions. All that these tech billionaires really did was find applications for technology that we as a people already paid for. To me, that has got to be the best example of shifting costs to somebody else in the history of the universe. But Catherine is not talking about that here. In this chapter, she's mainly talking about corporations using political clout to get resources for cheap and then dump costs back on the taxpayers. For example, she says, the American people give away national resources for pennies on the dollar, including oil, mining, and grazing rights, and forego state and federal revenues through government tax breaks and subsidies. She also mentions the monumental cost of toxic waste cleanup, as well as the cost of the regulatory agencies that are needed to oversee these industries. The point she's making here is that this is not free market capitalism, it's corporatism. Next, Catherine sets her sights on Walmart. Just one of many examples, but one that most everybody's familiar with. She says Walmart is an excellent example of not so free enterprise at work. The American people have provided more than $1 billion in state and local subsidies to the world's largest corporation. She then goes ahead and lists all those subsidies, including property tax breaks, state income tax credits, and sales tax rebates. Do you think small mom and pop and other small businesses get those breaks and credits? That's why they're hurting. That's why a lot of them go out of business. And why wages and benefits at small companies that remain open tend to decrease. She also says that Walmart is among China's top 10 trading partners. The other 9 are countries, not individual corporations. The main point is that this is not free market capitalism. It's corporatism. Other nerds give lots more examples, and there's an excellent video that I'll link to in the description box below, explaining how multi-billion-dollar oil companies and chemical companies made Louisiana one of the most poverty-stricken states in the nation. I need to keep moving, because Catherine next talks about what's called privatization. Giving credit where credit is due, she says that there are successful private operations and joint projects where taxpayers benefit, but then immediately says, many times the end result is higher prices, bad service, and worse. The corporate profit motive can create perverse incentives. She immediately starts talking about private prisons, also known as the private corrections industry, which probably every black American knows about already. By the way, don't ever joke to a white liberal that the private prison industry created the Black Lives Matter movement because trigger-happy racist cops are depriving them of revenue. Liberals wouldn't think that's funny. Most black Americans probably would, in a sadly ironic kind of way. The point Catherine makes about privatization is that corporate ownership of public services typically leads to higher costs and worse service for the public, which leads her into the privatization of public utilities. Older California residents probably remember what privatization of electric companies by corporations like Enron did to the cost of electricity out there, not to mention service. And millions of Texans found out early this year, February 2021, when sub-freezing temperatures for a week took out the power grid down there. But private water companies are more widespread across the country, including Florida, where I live, and so Catherine focuses in on them. After Congress passed the Water Investment Act of 2002, local communities were required to look into privatizing their water systems before receiving federal funding. Catherine says that communities that took the bait began experiencing huge rate hikes and poor maintenance of their water lines. Catherine does not go into the virtual monopolies that bought-off politicians have given a few mega corporations providing cable TV and internet service, but everybody probably already knows that already, and other nerds cover it, and so I'll get to that whenever. Catherine next goes into environmental disasters caused mainly by big oil companies that would have just walked away saying, oops, sorry about that, if federal regulators hadn't gone after them to clean up the huge messes they made through their own negligence. You pretty much have to be an old fart like me to remember the Exxon Valdez disaster in '89, unless you live on Alaska's Prince William Sound, where beaches were still fouled with oil when Catherine wrote this in 2011. Those beaches are probably still fouled today in 2021. And the settlement terms are probably still being worked out today in court as well. And this is a disaster that happened in 1989. Catherine goes on to talk about the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. My deepest condolences to the families of the dead, but I laughed out loud when Catherine gave a verbal smackdown to a retarded by ideology pseudo-intellectual nerd for saying that it was just an accident and arguing that BP shouldn't have to pay for the cleanup. Taxpayers should have to pay for it. The kicker is Rand Paul, who by the way believes in a depraved, unchristian, undemocratic, uncapitalistic ideology called libertarianism. He didn't believe that there should be any government agencies to regulate corporations to keep such accidents from happening to begin with. The kicker to the kicker is that Rand Paul believed that taxpayers should have to pay for the cleanup, but he was firmly against raising taxes to pay for the cleanup. This, to genius Rand Paul, is what free enterprise and capitalism are all about. Catherine devotes about 5 pages to corporate health care in America. She says corporate political influence has thoroughly warped our health care system. I would say corrupted it, but hey, tomato, tomato, tomato. Her first target is the massively profitable health insurance industry. Catherine points out that what is today known as Obamacare started out as a Republican plan to boost health insurance company profits by requiring Americans to purchase health insurance. She also points out the epic hypocrisy of corporatists pushing Obamacare into law and then attacking it as socialism. Just so you know, Obamacare didn't work out to be as profitable as corporatists had hoped, thanks to many millions of marginally or self-employed Americans like me telling corporatist politicians to take their individual mandate and shove it up their ass. Having said that, I need to add something. That's because a lot of people are going to be saying, well, because scofflaws like you refused to buy health care, that drove up the cost of health insurance for the rest of us. That very well may be true, but only in a corrupt corporatist system where people are required by law to go through a profit-sucking middleman in order to get health care. This does not mean that I'm in favor of lefty-lib Medicare for all. That's because it creates what nerds call a perverse incentive for healthcare providers to hospitalize every patient they see, to do every test, treatment, therapy, procedure, and surgery that could by any stretch of the imagination be considered medically justifiable for every single patient, so they can bill Medicare for all of it and then get the maximum compensation. There are some very smart true nerds in the field of healthcare who have come up with better solutions, generally called affordable healthcare. If and when we the people ever eliminate this corporatist abomination, maybe we can put something like that in place. I wanted to squish this chapter into one video, but I'm only a little over halfway through and there's still a lot of important stuff left. So I'll continue it next time. See you then. If you like this video, why not click the like button? I'll put a link to the next episode over here.